Welcome to The Breach Show, featuring sharp analysis on politics and social movements in Canada. I'm your host, Desmond Cole. Canada is cutting back on immigration, including temporary foreign workers, international students, permanent resident arrivals, and asylum seekers. The federal Liberal government says that an imbalance in immigration has negatively affected the Canadian economy, as well as access to housing and healthcare. But the feds have also abandoned a commitment to regularize thousands of migrants who are already here and who were promised a pathway to citizenship. They continue to live and to work in Canada, and their lack of status makes them easier targets for exploitation in the form of unsafe work conditions, wage theft, and threats of deportation if they speak out against their employers. To discuss all of this today, I'm joined by Deena Ladd, the executive director and a founder of the Workers' Action Center, a worker-based organization committed to improving the lives and working conditions of people in low-wage and unstable employment. Hi, Deena.
Hello, Desmond.
So last year, the federal government of Justin Trudeau made it clear that it would not keep its promise to regularize non-status workers and students. And at that time, the Migrant Rights Network said that the Liberals were pitting citizens and non-citizens against each other to distract from poor labor practices by corporations and the government. I want to play a clip from Sarome Rowe, a representative from Migrant Rights Network at that time. Let's listen.
Permanent residents and citizens are also experiencing massive food insecurity and uncertainty about the future, and they're being told to blame migrants. These are divide and distract tactics. They hide the fact that the super rich are making record-breaking profits while the majority of us go hungry, that corporate landlords are buying up housing stock to manufacture scarcity, and that the public institutions we value so deeply, like healthcare and education, are being chopped up and sold by the pound to private profiteers.
So since those comments late last year, immigration numbers are down across the board in Canada, and anti-immigration rhetoric is increasing. The Federal Immigration Department says, quote, "The number of new students and workers arriving in Canada is declining, a clear sign that the measures we've put in place are working," unquote. But they're not talking much about the estimated millions who are still living and working here, doing some of the most difficult work under the most unsafe and exploitative conditions. And Deena, that's where I'd like to begin our conversation. So as Canada continues to deepen the divide between workers with citizenship or permanent residency status and workers with uncertain immigration status or who are simply undocumented, what impact do you see this having on working conditions in our country?
I mean, I think it's huge. I mean, I have to say it's been quite shocking to sort of see the 360 turn from the federal government's hail of migrants as heroes during the pandemic. I mean, the pandemic wasn't that far away. It was only like 5 years ago when it started, and during that time period, all the workers that you're talking about were the ones that stepped up and did all the essential jobs, which allowed many Canadians to stay at home and stay safe. And so, as soon as the pandemic started to sort of end in 2023, absolutely we see this sort of, rise of Pierre Poilievre's attack on immigrant communities, on everything being out of control, and in particular using the spending that happened by the Liberal government during the pandemic to again help people to pay their bills. And I'm talking about the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, to try to vilify that. And in order to vilify that, he had to paint a picture of things being out of control, and in order for him to win the elections. And so this is where I see our communities being these pawns in these political games between the political parties. And so what that's meant for many of the people that I work with is that, they are increasingly afraid of going out. They're increasingly nervous about going to public spaces. increasingly worried about losing their jobs, worried about being able to say anything. The threats of deportations by employers is becoming more and more intense and severe on a daily basis. And it becomes even more severe when you talk about the affordability crisis. So for someone who is in an apartment which maybe they can afford or barely afford at this moment, but if their employer knows where they live and they're threatening them with deportation if they speak up around not being paid their wages, it means a whole host of things for a lot of migrant workers and for people who are undocumented. It means you have to find a new place to live first. You have, before you can even say anything, before you can even file a complaint, before you can even speak up about the fact that you haven't been paid your wages, all of that puts increased pressure on your ability to speak up, to to talk about what's happening at work, to be able to challenge the unfairness and the violations of rights. And I think it's not just for migrants and for undocumented people. I think this kind of scapegoating, it impacts us all, whether we're undocumented or whether we're citizens, because the thing is that the rhetoric basically pushes workers who may have citizenship to also feel afraid and to also be looking behind their shoulder, right? To sort of think, oh, who am I going to be next, when the job market has become increasingly quite difficult. And I think everybody is feeling very insecure right now with Trump's tariffs, the threats on many of the different sectors of in the labor market. And so that uncertainty also creates divisions and also creates this sense that because the economy is so uncertain, I can't afford to lose this job. I also need to watch out for that temp worker, that migrant worker, that person, the other person who might be after this job, which I really need at this moment because I can't afford my rent. I don't know how long this job is going to last, and I'm barely making ends meet. And so the entire discourse basically creates a feeling of uncertainty for everybody in the labor market.
No doubt. And Sarome Rowe's comments there about divide and conquer seem to be really becoming more true by the day. There's been a lot of focus by politicians, particularly in this country, on the temporary foreign worker program. And many politicians are claiming, without much evidence, that the temporary foreign worker program is taking jobs away from Canadians, particularly young Canadians. And it's important to note that the temporary foreign worker program accounts for about 1% of Canada's overall workforce. But I want to ask you, Deena, why are these workers such an easy political target?
Well, they're an easy political target because they are seen as other. And I think when someone like Pierre Poilievre sort of paints people as other, I think they become an easier scapegoat and it's easy to spread lies. I mean, we know that the kinds of jobs that temporary foreign workers are coming into the country to work in have nothing to do with youth unemployment. In fact, most workers coming in through the temporary foreign worker program are working on farms, are working in fisheries, are working in long-term care, are working in, meat processing plants. These are not jobs that young people go into. And I mean, we know that young people go into jobs like, the service sector, hospitality, retail, the food industry, not the meat processing plants. Not a lot of people like to do those jobs, let me tell you. And so I think that again, it's a way of whipping up misinformation to sort of get parents worried about their children not being able to find jobs, and And actually, if you ask a young person what kind of work they want, they're not going to talk about, well, I want to work in a meat processing plant, or I want to work in long-term care, or look after elderly people and, take on a cleaning job in a medical building, or clean grocery stores at night, or, do any of the kinds of factory work that a lot of our members do. In fact, that is absolutely what they don't want to do, which is why you have this contradiction where you've got employers of box stores, of the hospitality sector, of the restaurant industry, of the farm sector, the food industry basically saying to the government, we want temporary foreign workers, we want them to come into our country. And of course, they want them through the temporary foreign worker program because those workers will be tied to them, and their only ability to stay in the country will be because of them, which then basically, puts a gag over their mouth and makes them into an incredibly vulnerable situation. And then on the other hand, you've got people like Polyev, and you've got the prime minister, buying into this rhetoric where suddenly, you know, are the people coming in through these programs are now the reason for youth unemployment, in addition to every other economic issue that our communities are suffering from. So this is a very common strategy when people are complaining, and people are wondering why is this happening. um, and so that, we see this all the time. And so for me, the issue is, why are we not talking about creating decent jobs? Why are we not allowing workers to come into this country without being indentured to an employer? What are people so afraid of? And I think employers are afraid because they know that if they do not indenture workers to their actual place of employment, people will come into this country and then they'll actually try and find a decent job, because that job is not going to be a decent one, the one that they're indentured into. And that's the only reason why they can find workers to do that work, because people have no other choice in many of our own home countries, who are dealing with so many other issues.
There was a presser in Ottawa yesterday, in fact, where many migrant workers and advocates for migrant workers spoke out. And the number one demand, and I've been following this issue at length for some time, the number one demand is always that people have open work permits rather than the closed ones that you're talking about, where they're forced to work only for one employer, which of course opens them to all kinds of abuse. It's also the case that many of these workers that you work with every day are not unionized, and some temporary workers aren't allowed legally to unionize in Canada. And I wanted to ask you quickly what impact that has on equitable or unsafe working conditions.
I mean, I would even say that people should be allowed to come into this country with PR. That's the system that my family came into
With
this
permanent
country
residency.
with permanent residency
Yeah.
in 1987. My parents are my dad was a car mechanic from England. My mum was an office worker. They're not from the business class. They don't have master's degrees and, PhDs. They came here as working people, as many of us did during that period of time. And we were allowed to come into this country with permanent residency. And even then, the struggle that our family had to settle into this country was really, really hard, as again, what many people experience in terms of credentials and trade credentials not being recognized due to racism around, so-called Canadian experience. So if my family was to come in now in 2025, we would not be allowed to come into this country except through the temporary foreign worker program, where we would come in and we wouldn't have PR upon arrival. We would be indentured to an employer, and we would face the kinds of hardships that many of the people that I work with now are dealing with. So I shouldn't have to be the one to say I was so lucky to come here with PR. If you're wanting a workforce to come into this country to do jobs that you can't find people to do, people should be allowed to come into this country with PR, with all the safety and access to labor rights and the ability to settle their children with no hardship and with no abuse and not being vulnerable to the kinds of exploitation that we're seeing. So absolutely, in addition to PR upon arrival, many of the people I work with would love to be part of a union. They would love to be part of the union movement, but because of how they're hired, they have very little access to unions. So they work either through subcontractors, they work through labor leases, they work through temp agencies, they work through recruiters, and they're working through all of these brokers that supply work to companies like Magna, to farms, to places like Canadian Tire, but they're all those invisible workers that would never be seen as part of the workforce. And so if a union tries to organize a subcontractor, the main employer, which is the main retailer or the main company, all they have to do is just switch the subcontractor and fire that subcontractor or get rid of the temp agency. And so one of the things that the Workers Action Center is trying to do is we're just about to launch a campaign on wage theft. And again, we've been saying this for a while, but we're going to say it again, is that unless you want to actually stop wage theft, you have to hold those at the top of the power chain responsible for all the conditions below. We understand this internationally when everything came to light in the 1990s around Adidas and Reebok and Nike doing offshore production in countries in Asia where the conditions were so low and the retailers were saying it's not my business, I'm not the employer. But we fought to say, no, you are responsible and you're liable for the way your shoes and sneakers and clothes are being made in Myanmar and Bangladesh or wherever else they're being produced. The same thing has to happen domestically. You cannot have large corporations just say, it's not my problem, I don't hire these workers. They are fundamentally doing the work for your company. You're just not actually hiring them. You have avoided your responsibility as an employer and given that to a middle company like a temp agency or a subcontractor. And so what we're doing is trying to put that liability and put that responsibility back, just as international campaigns have done that with these large multinational corporations. And so that is fundamentally also what we have to take on.
We've also heard migrant workers and advocates talking about programs and services that workers pay into, but are not allowed to access. And I wonder, can you give us some examples of these programs and services and talk about the impact of migrant workers being barred from accessing them?
There are a lot of misconceptions out there that somehow migrant workers, undocumented people, refugees have access to all of these different types of services. It's absolutely not true. In fact, many of the state funded, especially from the immigration department, the way that those programs are put out, you have to be a refugee claimant. So you actually have to have gotten your official brown paper, or you have to have PR. If you don't have those, many services are denied to you. A lot of farm workers, for instance, pay into employment insurance when they work here on farms for, it could be 3, 4 months to up to 6 months of the year, and are not allowed to actually claim employment insurance when they go back home, even though they've paid into it, which I think is kind of shocking because everyone knows employment insurance is one of the main programs that keeps the fisheries and all of the workers who actually survive when the season for fishing is over, they're able to go on employment insurance and they're able to pay their bills. However, you have the same thing happening with the seasonal agricultural workers program, where we know a lot of workers have come to Canada for 20 years and have been working 8 months, 6 to 8 months of the year here in this country, paying into the program and doing this work and then coming back, but when they leave to go back home, they have no access to the program that they've been paying into. I think we also need to remember that undocumented workers are working and are paying taxes every time they buy something, every time they use a service, every time they purchase something. They are paying taxes into our system, and they want to pay more taxes if they could have access to regularization. And so I think that there again are these stereotypes and these misconceptions that the right is using to give that notion that people are living on the hog, they're not paying their fair share, they're not paying their way, that they're taking all these services. And it's absolutely just not true. And I think if people actually spent the time to realize what programs and services are available, I think they would be absolutely shocked. I think partly they're shocked because when they also try to get access to these services, they're like, what is this? Like, this is not going to help me survive. And then they think somehow that migrants are getting more and better services. And again, this misconception is the only one that benefits from these types of misconceptions are the right, in terms of turning people against each other. And instead of thinking, why are these programs so bad? Why are these services so bad? Why is it that I can't find a doctor? It's easy to point the finger at the one person that everybody knows who is, somehow abusing the system, and therefore, thousands of people are then painted with the same brush.
The conversations in this country about what's not working in the Canadian economy have focused a lot on workers themselves, and particularly some of the most precarious workers. But there hasn't been a lot of talk about employers.
Hmm.
Corporate profits and corporate profit margins rose considerably in recent years. You were mentioning the COVID-19 pandemic and how, at its height, it was a lot of precarious and temporary and migrant workers who were holding up the economy. But during the same time, according to a recent report from Canadians for Tax Fairness, corporations were not only reaping record profits and having record profit margins, they're also choosing to pay out their shareholders and to buy up more of their own shares instead of reinvesting in the Canadian economy and boosting wages or hiring more workers, for example. I've heard you raise this point a lot, Deena, so I wonder, how is it connected to the anti-immigrant conversations that are taking place right now?
Yeah, I think it's a total double standard. You have all these corporations, like as you said, take take dollars that were there by the federal government given to them to help them through the pandemic, but instead of giving it to the workers that were doing the work, they gave it to their shareholders. And then you have these kind of witch hunts for some person who somehow abused CERB and was living high off the hog on $2,000 a month to try and pay their bills, and somehow they are the criminal in all of this. And so I think it provides another distraction. If corporations are also able to use the misconceptions of some workers abusing the system, or some people trying to benefit from welfare, which I mean is like $700 a month, as opposed to people not understanding that if they paid their fair share of corporate taxes and they actually reinvested their money into the Canadian economy, we would do so much better, and we would not be dealing with the kinds of issues that we're having around lack of public funding for the kinds of bread and butter necessities of life. And so I think we always have to ask the question, who benefits from the misinformation? Who benefits from scapegoating immigrants and migrants and refugees? Who benefits from everybody pointing the finger at their neighbor rather than actually pointing at government decisions that have been made to privatize and to pull the services, the vital services that we need, from actually being delivered by unionized public sector workers to now corporations. And so I think that what we're actually seeing here is corporations working hand in hand with government, because they're benefiting from the kinds of government decisions that are being made to privatize more and more of public services. So, for instance, and I don't think that a lot of people understand this, but employment services in Ontario, for instance, have now been privatized. The Ford government basically has not only just opened the door to for-profit companies to bid against non-profit agencies for the delivery of those services, but also the management of those services. So now we have American and Australian corporations actually managing and dividing up the monies in regions of Ontario to for-profit, non-profit delivery agencies. The whole system has become privatized, and it's happened in such a quiet, insidious way that nobody understands what's going on. The same thing is happening around our healthcare. The same thing is happening in hospitals, and the same thing is happening in our colleges and universities. And it's happening at such a fast pace and in such an insidious way that a lot of people don't understand this, and they are not understanding where our public money is actually going. It's actually going to corporations who are raking in profits for themselves and not actually putting it back into the public system if it was being delivered by government and by public sector workers.
You mentioned corporations not paying their fair share of taxes. When it comes to more accountability, are there specific other measures that the federal government could be taking towards corporations that would help improve wages and working conditions for all workers in the country?
I think procurement policies I think are really important. I think standards for how procurement happens for services and for how people can bid on things. So in addition to corporate tax, what are some of the community standards that we want in terms of decent jobs, environmental protections, human rights? Because remember, our laws are just really the basics, right? They're just the floor that you can't go below. And so procurement policies can be more than that. They can actually say, if you're going to build roads or you've got a huge construction project in this community, how much money are you giving back to the community? How much profit is reasonable for you to expect on the backs of our tax dollars? How much training? How many jobs are you developing? Are you putting money towards public services? Are you investing in public transportation and infrastructure? Because remember, all of these companies that get these huge development projects, they are then relying on our public money to provide the entire infrastructure around that corporation, the sewers, the garbage pickup, the water mains, the public transportation that workers rely on getting there. Just imagine if corporations in this country had to take responsibility for investing into public transportation. We could then have an affordable system, a system that was not breaking down all the time. We would actually have proper transportation between cities. People in the north have no ability to travel anywhere now. There are very few ways to get around the province, for instance. And so what we've seen is this incredible downward pressure of all the costs around business being put on communities and individually put on the backs of workers. And the government is the one that has the ability to regulate, to enforce, and to ensure that that doesn't happen. But when you have government working hand in hand with corporations and wanting them to take over all of the kinds of things that we hold to be valued, then we have a huge problem. And that is what we're witnessing right now.
We saw you recently, Deena, at Christie Pitts Park in Toronto, leading a very large pro-immigration rally in response to an anti-immigrant rally that was taking place in that park. I know you speak with a lot of people, including immigrants, who are sympathetic to these ideas that immigration is the problem, that immigration is hurting our country. And I want to know, how do you approach those conversations? How do you engage people who believe and repeat these messages, which are so often informed by misinformation, by racism, and by xenophobia?
I mean, those people are people from my family. I don't know many of us who have family members who are up on every political strategy or left perspective. Many of us have our community members and our family and friends and parents who have also bought into these misconceptions and this sense that, there's this scarcity, that we have to close the borders, that we don't have enough, all of that worry around the tensions of the tariffs. At the Worker Center, we have workers come into the center every day who have workplace problems and are coming to us to talk about what's going on at their workplace. And they also have those misconceptions. And I think it's really important to open up the space to have a conversation, to be able to discuss this in a way that people are not put down, people are able to learn, people are able to change their perspective, people can get access to education, to workshops, for conversations where it's okay to make a mistake. It's okay to not say the to say the right thing. I've been doing this work for a long, long, long time, but it's come through years and years of relearning, unlearning, educating myself to kind of understand a bunch of this stuff. If many of the people in our communities are just running all the time. They've come to this country, they're in job after job, they're exhausted at the end of the day. They turn on, the local radio show or the local TV station. They're not necessarily having the time to kind of peruse the internet for a left perspective on things and to go to a workshop and go to a community event. People are just surviving. And so I think if we understand that, I think we need to understand then our role in the movement, which is to not just put everybody in one basket, but to actually kind of think through, how are we going to engage and how are we going to shift their understanding and to change the narrative around this. And I think that that is a really huge challenge for us, but I think it's an important one, and it's one that we cannot avoid, and it's one that we actually have to really figure out.
Now, finally, I want to ask you, what has fighting with some of the most precarious workers in this country taught you about solidarity? And I'm thinking particularly, Deena, about solidarity between workers with unions and stability versus workers who are precarious, workers who are Canadian citizens versus workers who don't have permanent status here. What has your work taught you about those potential links and relationships?
That's a really good question. I think we have a tendency in the left to just try and also feel more comfortable with just dividing our groups into all of these categories. And I think if we do that, we are allowing the way the state sees us and the way they see us in these categories to divide working people generally. And I think that's why in the Worker Center we've really deliberately tried to be always building unity and solidarity. So to look at it from, for instance, trying to bring undocumented workers together with long-term immigrants and long-term Canadian citizens, looking at building bridges between union members and non-union members, building bridges between multiracial communities and multi-linguistic, multi-religion, multi-regional, where people would never even kind of connect with each other because they don't speak the same language, they don't share the same religion, culture, anything, to try to intentionally and purposefully build those connections. And I think it is going to be really critical to our success to continue to do that. I think we're also interested in building a political understanding of, oppression, of human rights, using the basis of us as workers helps us enter into a conversation. You can have 10 people around a table who may have all experienced not getting paid their wages, but come from very, very, very different backgrounds. But the one thing they have in common is that they've not been paid their wages. Or you can have 10 people around a table who are all having a hard time making ends meet and are really worried about their jobs and about how their kids are going to take care of themselves. And they could be coming from many different immigration statuses and many different walks of life. Our job is to build that political understanding between people that our interests are the same and that we're actually all very much fighting for the same thing. I don't think any of us are fighting to become a billionaire. I don't think any of us are fighting to become a CEO of a corporation. I think in some ways, when you really, really kind of break it down, a lot of people are just looking for the same things. So those points of unity we have to use to build connections in our communities, because if we don't, the cost is real, and we're seeing that cost already right now. And I think that we have to be brave. I think we have to be courageous. I think we have to understand that we cannot just talk to ourselves, that we have to be out there talking to people who we've never spoken to before, and that it's going to be a hard process, and that's okay. Relationships take time, trust takes time, building connections between communities who have been really, really marginalized takes time. This is not a 2-year thing. This is like, I'm talking about 10 years, 15 years, 20 years of being there all the time and being a witness to what is going on, and then being there to support and build solidarity in any way you can. And I think that that then fundamentally changes the nature of how you organize, how you see each other, how you build relationships, and then how you struggle together, because then you see your common interests. And so I think for the world that we have now and for the struggles that we have now ahead of us, we really need to be thinking through our strategy with more intentionality and not just panic and reactivity. We have to be understanding that it's going to take a deeper building and organizing to face the challenges ahead of us.
It is always a pleasure to speak with you, Deena. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
If you like what you've heard on The Breach Show, please subscribe to the podcast. And if you'd like to support our work, please become a sustaining member of the podcast to help us produce more journalism for transformation. And you can do that by going to breachmedia.ca/support. Thanks for listening.